New Business Radio. Let's talk business.
We are back at IBC 2018 with Media Park Live.
Okay, so we're back now for our last two guests. Welcome to the show, Georg from Red Bee Media. You were here yesterday talking about personalization, and today you're here with Steve Plunkett, AI guru.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Good afternoon. Georg, I'm going to hand over to you, and I'm going to take it easy for the next. So you can ask some really tough questions to Steve, and then I'm going to probably throw in a few curveballs just to kind of keep Steve on his toes. He needs that.
Right, thank you. I mean, it will be a little bit difficult because I think Steve knows everything, you know.
I wouldn't say that.
About AI, especially, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So just to make a little, or give a little bit more background on Steve, so he's a very well-known CTO. He was the CTO of Ericsson Broadcast and Media Services, now called Red Bee, technology innovator in the media industry, and having spent over 25 years building products and services in leadership roles at Motorola, Red Bee, Ericsson, and others. And you actually moderated one of the key panels at this year's Dave & Croft event on cloud economics. So that was actually quite a good, perceived, and nice panel.
It was a great panel, some great speakers and some good conversation. Yeah.
Right, but I mean, today we're going to talk about AI, ML, deep learning. You know, I mean, there's so much buzz around it in the industry. Maybe you can give a little bit of history on these topics.
Sure. So the term artificial intelligence is attributed to a conference back in 1956 in Dartmouth College in the US, attended by some real luminaries of that age. People like Marvin Minsky and Claude Shannon, the founder of information theory. And the idea was to see if machines could be programmed to behave and think like people and perform equivalent or even more advanced tasks than we do. And obviously since that time, there's been many developments and advances. And so the terms artificial intelligence is quite general, and machine learning is a subset of that. And machine learning really conceptually has been around for a very long time. Practically has been applied and used for the last 10 or 15 years more effectively. And the concept is, rather than having to create complex human-generated rules for how a machine can interact with its environment or with information, the machine instead learns from information and data natively. And more recent advances include what's today called deep learning, but it's using large or deep neural networks to analyze very large volumes of data and infer from that insight and typically make predictions. You know, is this a cat or a dog? To give it a very simple term.
I mean, there is, you know, like, I mean, some people say, I mean, AI will have kind of like the same impact on the economy as, you know, like the invention of energy had, right? And I mean, I think the big question is a little bit, what does AI actually mean for the media industry?
Yeah, and that's a great quote from Andrew Ng, who was CTO at Baidu and Stanford professor, very well respected AI expert and commentator. And I think in media, if you think of what AI is particularly good at today, understanding and analysing still and moving pictures. And clearly that's a big part of the media industry. Understanding text and deriving meaning, so what's often called natural language processing. Converting spoken words into text, so automatic speech recognition. So there's a few categories around images, language, audio, that of course are essential to the whole being of media and the media industry, that AI is getting better and better at.
But Steve, and I've seen now some stories about how AI is being almost misused to create fake news, that it's being used in the production of video and audio.
Yeah, there's been various, you know, nefarious and comical examples of that use, but with computer vision in particular, of that particular application, it's reached a stage where an AI can create very believable pictures by morphing together, for example, two people. So you take one person and you change the face for another person, and you'll see some of that on consumer applications, on your phones and so on. But that's got implications for truth, and, you know, is what you see something that you should believe? So yeah, it does play a part, some part, in the current fake news debate, but also plays a very positive part in filtering, identifying, and flagging fake news. So it's on both sides of the debate.
I mean, where do you actually think we stand? I mean, is AI a bubble? Or, I mean, where do you think we stand in the whole, life cycle?
That's a good question. I mean, it's clearly very topical right now. It's discussed in many industries, not just media. It's in mainstream press, and people talk about the benefits and some of the concerns for society and humanity even. If we go back to the history piece, from the mid-1950s through to the early 1970s, there was a big boom in research funding and industry activity that ultimately failed to live up to its promises for a whole range of different reasons. And what's now referred to as the AI winter took place in the mid-1970s. And so the bubble burst and research funding was directed elsewhere. It came back again in the early 1980s, and by the late 1980s had a second AI winter and the bubble burst. Now, since then, it's been a much slower but more measurable improvements in things like machine learning and computer vision that we said. So I think this incarnation of AI with deep learning is here to stay. I think there's probably exuberance in terms of how much impact it might have in the short term. And I think it was a Bill Gates quote from some years ago that we tend to massively overestimate the impact of technology on a 2-year horizon and massively underestimate it on, let's say, a 10-year horizon. So, whether there's exuberance and raised expectations that will fail to be fully realised in the next year or two, probably. Is AI going to disappear? No.
I mean, you are an independent advisor now, right? I mean, would you, or do you advise, the companies you advise to invest in AI?
Absolutely. Well, I advise them to understand AI. I think that's the first step. So education, then experimentation. AI comes in many, many different forms. You can apply it, like I said, to pictures, sound, text, and structured data. So, tabular information that you'd have from finance systems and other things. So there are many, many ways you can use it. It's very fast moving, particularly over the last 24 months. So you need to not just evaluate it now and make some decisions, you need to continuously do that. But I think it would be foolhardy for any business, really, not to understand what it has to offer now and how that might impact a particular business.
And Steve, do you need to be a big company to be able to afford to use AI and develop it, or could anyone get involved?
Today, the barriers to entry are very, very much reduced. I mean, 10, 15, certainly 20 years ago, you'd need a supercomputer, a lot of very specialist scientists who could understand how to program and use these systems. And there's been a commoditization, I guess, of the tools. So the tools are available now relatively inexpensively from public cloud providers. There's a great deal of open source algorithms. There's lots of public data that's been made available and lots of shared knowledge and learning that's available. So it's never been easier to learn and use AI and try and make some practical applications. I wouldn't like to trivialize how easy that is, of course, because you need to understand a particular business context. You need to get data, you need to get lots of data in many cases. That's often much more difficult than actually applying the AI process. But it's certainly not something which is the preserve of the large corporate entities, not at all.
I mean, if we're gonna look a little bit ahead, I mean, every year IBC seem to have kind of like one big trend that comes and go, right? And I mean, what do you think? I mean, will AI still be a key theme for next year's IBC?
Yeah, I think because it's a foundational, fundamental technology, it's not like 3D TV, which was a consumer proposition that spectacularly failed, I guess, in terms of in-home viewing. And despite the hype, and it had its year or 2 years. And AI is more like the cloud or the transition to IP. It's a long-term fundamental change of how we'll use media technology. So I don't think it's going to disappear. Its prominence may fade. And success is probably to be measured when it's just embedded within products and the way that we operate within businesses, rather than being seen as a standalone thing.
Right. So it's, I mean, really I think it's a good comparison probably to the cloud, right? I mean, a couple of years back at IBC, everything was cloud, and every company kind of like tried to kind of like embrace the cloud. And nowadays, I mean, companies basically use whatever on Amazon, for example, for providing that as a tool or as a service, right? In order to
it's boringly sort of routine, but yet transformative. And AI will have a broader and more significant impact, I think, than the cloud. The cloud is also a key enabler for AI, so the two have a relationship.
I mean, if you look at it a little bit like at the AI, let's call it like value chain, right? I mean, you have the AI tools, obviously, and then you have data and then potentially some applications on top of it. What do you think, I mean, if you look at the companies who are in this value chain, who probably, I mean, are probably best positioned in order to make most value or can, you know, increase their market share based on AI?
I think companies who've got data structured in a way that's suitable for use in AI have advantages. So those companies who've got access to interesting and ideally high volume data are probably best placed, at least today.
So one last question. So what has actually caught your eye at this show?
I think from an AI perspective, I wouldn't like to name check any individual company. I've seen lots of really interesting stuff. I think what's been fascinating is how omnipresent it is. So everybody, like the cloud a year or two ago, every product vendor is highlighting how they're using AI. And I think that's a measure of its development. It'll be something which is not a standout feature, but a base capability for products. So I've seen it used in production, post-production, distribution, content analysis, metadata creation, search, discovery, all those areas, and many, many exciting applications.
I've got one more question, if that's okay. So how should we that work in the broadcast industry feel about the oncoming AI tide? You know, should we be worried about our jobs and our skill sets, or do you see it's going to be a long, smooth transition and that the roles will change?
I think that's up for us as businesses and as society to decide. But understanding what it is and understanding what it's capable of, when you boil it down, it's actually mundane in some ways. It's not magical technology. So getting rid of some of the mystique and the mystery around it is very helpful. And then understanding how it can be used, by you and how governments can consider its wider implications in terms of employment and so on is definitely an important policy question.
So don't be afraid.
I wouldn't be afraid. I'd learn more about it rather than be ignorant and fearful of it.
It's good philosophy generally, I think, in life, isn't
yes,
it?
Indeed.
Okay, Georg and Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
It's been great to have you on the show. That's it for today. We're now going to go off air, I think, for a while, and then we're back here on the Red Bee Media Tech Talk at 1500, 3 o'clock Central European Time tomorrow. Thanks very much.